My name is Father Theodore Casey. I am 78 years old. I was ordained in the Diocese of Hurst in the spring of 1948, and I served as the resident priest of St. Brendan's Mission on the Nagagami River for 24 years, from 1950 until the mission was absorbed into the parish structure in 1974. I have been retired now for 11 years, living in a small house on Theriot Street in Timmins, and I have a recorder on my kitchen table that my niece's husband showed me how to use. And I intend to use it this morning, while my hands are still steady, and while the coffee is still warm, and while I still have the legal and moral right to speak. Bishop Hebert died on the 3rd of February. He died at 81 years of age, in the hospital in Sudbury, with his housekeeper at his side. And he died holding, as I understand it, a rosary that had belonged to his mother. I am not the man to judge him. I never was. What I am saying is that he is gone, and when he was alive, I had given him my word. I had given him my word in a formal meeting in his office on the 14th of March, 1958, that I would not speak of a specific matter to any person outside the seal of confession, and that I would not seek to have any record of that matter restored to any diocesan archive, and that I would carry what I knew to my own grave and release it only to God. I said yes. I meant it when I said it. I still believe that a man's word given to a bishop, even a bishop who was wrong, is not a small thing, but he is dead. He died on the 3rd of February, and I waited 63 days out of respect. And because I am old, and I needed to think, and now I am sitting at this kitchen table with the recorder running, and I am going to tell you what I know. I am going to tell you what I witnessed, and what I did, and why I did it. And I am going to tell you that the Diocese of Hurst has, in its archive in the cathedral basement, a set of mission ledgers covering the years 1950 through 1974, and that in the baptismal record for St. Brendan's mission for the year 1954 there is a gap. An entry that was there when I submitted the ledger, and was not there when the ledger was returned to me. One name removed, one date removed, one entry in my own hand, gone as completely as if the ink had never dried on it. I know what was in that entry. I wrote it. I can tell you word for word what it said. But I am getting ahead of myself, and that is a habit I have been fighting for 78 years. Let me go back to the beginning, which is the only place a story like this can be properly told. The Nagagami River runs south from Nagagami Lake through a long valley of black, spruce and tamarack before it joins the Mississippi north of Hurst. And in 1950, when I arrived at St. Brendan's Mission, it was a country that felt as though it had barely agreed to be part of the century. The mission itself was 3 buildings, a chapel that sat 14 people on its benches, if they were willing to know each other, a rectory that sat 1 priest if he was willing to know himself, and a cookhouse that in those years was run by Constance Beaulieu, who was 51 years old when I arrived, and who had outlasted 2 previous priests, and did not appear to consider it a remarkable achievement. She was a large woman with a face like weathered maple, the widow of a trapper who had drowned in the Nagagami 8 years before I came, and she cooked without complaint, and prayed without performance, and kept the mission accounts with the precision of a woman who did not trust anyone else to do it correctly. I trusted her from the 2nd week. I trusted her completely by the 2nd month. In 24 years, she never gave me a reason to feel otherwise. The community, the mission, was not large. There were 6 or 7 Cree and Métis families who considered St. Brendan's their parish, some of them living within a mile of the chapel, others travelling 2 hours by canoe or snowshoe when the seasons allowed. There was also a small camp of seasonal trappers who rotated in and out, and a pair of brothers named Gauthier, who ran a supply route between Hurst and a mining operation 40 miles north, and who stopped at the mission regularly enough that I came to know their faces and their sins, and their specific ways of resisting improvement. The community taken together was perhaps 60 souls, not large, but it was mine to tend, and I tended it as carefully as I knew how. Marguerite Savavar came to me first in the autumn of 1950, 2 months after I arrived, to tell me that her husband Adelard had been killed in a logging accident in the camps near White River the previous spring, and that she had been managing alone since then, with her 8-year-old daughter Philomene in a cabin 3 miles up the east branch of the river. She was 28 years old at that time, small-framed and direct, with a kind of composure that is not coldness, but is the thing a person develops when they have had to be their own comfort for long enough. She spoke French with the particular flatness of someone who had learned it, alongside Cree, and treated both languages as tools rather than inheritances. She came to Mass when the season allowed, and she helped Constance in the cookhouse on the high feast days. And she asked nothing of me except the occasional Mass intention, and once, in the winter of 1952, help with a letter she needed to write to the provincial government about a land matter. I wrote the letter. The province did not answer it. She did not seem surprised. In the spring of 1953, Marguerite Savard went into the bush. This was not unusual. Half the people in that community went into the bush for weeks at a time. It was how they lived. It was what the country required of them. What was unusual was that she did not come back. The first week, Constance noted it. The second week, I noted it. By the end of the third week, Philomene had come to the cookhouse, asking whether her mother had perhaps gone to Hurst for supplies, and there was something in the way the child asked the question that told me she already knew the answer was no, and that she was asking because she needed someone to confirm that the world still had a shape. I want to be precise about what I knew and what I did not know during those 41 days. I did not know where Marguerite was. No one knew. Henri Gauthier offered to take his brother's truck and drive the bush roads to look for signs of her camp, and I said, I thought we should give her another week first. And he looked at me in a way that I understand now better than I understood it then. I think he already suspected something. I think some of the people in that community knew things about the country along the Nagagami that they had not told me, and that they had decided, without saying so aloud, to wait and see what the 41 days produced before they decided how much to tell the priest. I do not know what happened to Marguerite Savard in those 41 days. No one has ever told me, and she did not tell me, and whatever she and Philomene knew between them, they kept between them. I have thought about those 41 days for more than 60 years, and I have arrived at this. I do not need to know what happened. What I know is what I witnessed when she came back, which was enough. She came back on the 17th of May, 1953, in the early morning, when the river was still grey with mist and the spruce along the east bank had that particular dark stillness that they get before the light reaches them. I was on my way to the chapel for morning prayer when I saw her come out of the tree line at the edge of the clearing. She was walking steadily, not stumbling, not distressed in any visible way. but she was thinner than she had been, and she had a way of holding her arms slightly away from her sides, as though she had recently been carrying something very large, and her body had not yet remembered how to be without it. I called her name. She looked at me, and the look on her face was not relief. Exactly, but something that I will call arrival, which is different from relief, because it is not about escaping something, but about completing a journey that had a destination all along. I asked her if she was all right. She said she was. I asked if she was hurt. She said she was not. I asked if she was hungry, and she said yes, she was hungry, and that was all she said. I brought her to the cookhouse, and Constance made her eat without asking her any questions, because Constance understood that there was a time for questions, and this was not it. And I sat across the table from Marguerite Savard, and I watched her eat, and I thought about 41 days in the bush in northern Ontario in early spring, and I made a decision that I have never regretted, which was that I would follow her lead entirely, that I would ask nothing, that I would wait until she chose to speak, and that when she spoke, I would listen without judgment or procedure. I was a young priest, 29 years old. I am not sure I could have told you at the time exactly why I made that decision. I can tell you now. It was because her face, when she came out of that tree line, was the face of a woman who had been given something extraordinary and was carrying it carefully, the way you carry water in a vessel that has no lid. She came to confession that Sunday. She did not confess anything that had happened in the 41 days. I understood from this that she did not consider it a sin. I noticed that. I held it, the way you hold a fact that you do not yet know the shape of. By late summer it was apparent to Constance, and therefore to me, that Marguerite Savard was with child. She was not yet showing in any way that would have been visible to the men in the community. But Constance had 23 years of experience as the woman who knew everything that happened in that settlement before anyone else did. She came to me in September and told me plainly, and I told her plainly that I had already understood, and we agreed without any more words than that, to say nothing and do nothing, and continue to follow Marguerite's lead. The child was born in the second week of November, 1953. I know the exact date, but I will not say it here, because I have promised myself that this recording will not be the thing that makes it possible for someone to identify a specific living person, if there is a specific living person to identify. I was present for the birth. Constance managed it. Marguerite was composed throughout, in the way of a woman who had made her peace with something enormous some months before, and who was now simply completing the practical work of it. The birth took 4 hours. The child was healthy. He was 12 pounds and 8 ounces by the small scale. Constance kept in the cookhouse, and he was dark-haired, with eyes that were very dark brown, and of a size that I had not seen in an infant, and his hands were already large in a way that I can only describe by saying that when I held him for the first time, which Marguerite allowed me to do, for perhaps 30 seconds, his hands came around 2 of my fingers, and I felt the weight of something I do not have words for. He was a child. He was fully, unmistakably a child. That is what I knew then. That is what I know now. Marguerite named him Luke. She said this quietly, to no one in particular, in the way of a woman who had been turning the name over for months. She said it in French. She did not explain it. There was no explanation needed. Constance said very quietly that the name meant light. Marguerite looked at her, and something passed between them that I was not part of and did not expect to be part of. And then Marguerite looked down at the child and said, "Yes, that is what it means," and said nothing more. Henri Gauthier and his brother came to the cookhouse 2 days later and looked at the child and said nothing of consequence. Philomene was 10 years old by then, and she sat beside her mother's chair with a seriousness that I remember thinking was the most adult expression I had seen on a child's face in all my years of working among families who gave their children adult responsibilities early. She looked at her brother the way someone looks at a fact they have already accepted, which means she had known about the child before the child arrived. And she had already done whatever interior work was required of her. I have thought about Philomene often. She kept the secret for the rest of her life. She died in 2014 in a nursing home in Kapuskasing, and she never spoke of it to anyone outside the settlement, as far as I have been able to determine. She was a quiet and exceptionally serious person, and she loved her brother completely, and that is the fullest account I can give of her. I need to say something about the wider community's response, because it matters for what comes next. There was no meeting, no vote, no formal compact made between the people of that settlement about what they would do about Marguerite Savard's child. What happened was slower and more organic than that, and in my experience, it is always the slow, organic decisions that hold, because no one can undo a meeting that was never called. What happened was that Henri Gauthier came to the cookhouse and looked at the child and did not ask questions. What happened was that the Swanson family, who lived a mile north and attended Mass irregularly, came to see Marguerite the following Sunday, and Madames Swanson held the child for a few minutes in silence, and then gave Marguerite a jar of preserves and went home. What happened was that Brother André Morin, the young lay brother who had been sent to assist me at the mission, and who was 22 years old, and from a large family in Sturgeon Falls, and who had, I believe, never in his life encountered anything he could not find in his catechism, sat down in the chapel after Vespers one evening and prayed for a very long time, and then came to find me and said, in a voice that was steady but effortful, that he believed Marguerite's child was a child of God, and that he intended to treat him accordingly. And I said that this was exactly the correct conclusion, and that I was glad he had come to it on his own. André Morin kept that belief for 66 more years, until the night he died in a hospital bed in North Bay. And if the Catholic Church ever properly investigates the saints it has overlooked, he belongs on a list somewhere. By the spring of 1954, the child was 5 months old and growing at a rate that I noted in the private journal I kept in those years as remarkable. I was careful with the word. I have always been careful with that word. What I mean is that he was substantially larger than I had seen any child of that age be, and that his physical development in other respects, his motor control, the way he tracked movement with his eyes, his early attempts to produce sound, were also accelerated in ways that I measured against what I had observed in the families of my parish over 4 years and found to be beyond what I could account for by individual variation. I say this as a man who trusts measurement and mistrusts sensation. I noted it and I held it. In June of 1954, Marguerite Savard came to me and asked me to baptize her son. I want to be honest about what I felt when she said this, because I think it is part of the record. What I felt was not surprise exactly, and it was not certainty exactly, and it was not the clear-cut theological question it might appear to be from the outside. What I felt was the specific weight of a question that does not have a precedent in any document I had read in 7 years of seminary and 4 years of parish work. And the weight of that question was also, simultaneously, the recognition that the question did not actually require a precedent, because the answer was written plainly enough in the fundamental documents of the faith I had professed. The waters of baptism are for the children of God, and the children of God are all those God made, and the Church does not get to revise that inventory. I am not a theologian. I am a parish priest who had spent 4 years in the bush, learning that the country along the Nagagami River was not obligated to arrange itself according to any map I had been given. I said yes. I said it the same day she asked. I told no one outside the mission community that I intended to perform the baptism. I did not consult the diocese. I told myself that I would write to the bishop afterward, which I believed at the time. But I think now, in honesty, that I already knew I would not, or at least that I was not certain I would, and that this uncertainty was something I did not examine too closely, because I had already made up my mind, and examination would have been a form of delay that served no one. The baptism took place on the 14th of August, 1954. I know the date precisely because I recorded it in the baptismal ledger the same evening, in the entry that no longer exists. The ceremony was in the chapel in the early morning, with the door left open, because August in the north is warm, and the chapel had no ventilation, and because I think, in retrospect, I wanted the door open for reasons I did not name at the time. Present were Marguerite, Philomene, who was 11 years old and served as witness, Constance Beaulieu, and Brother André Morin, who served as the second witness and who held the baptismal candle with the expression of a man who has been given a responsibility he considers sacred. I will tell you about the ceremony. I will tell you about it carefully. Marguerite stood at the font with the child in her arms. He was 9 months old and he was large, already the size of a 2-year-old child by any measure I could apply, and he was dressed in a white garment that Constance had made from a length of cotton she had ordered from Hurst. He was calm. He was entirely calm, in the way of a child who is accustomed to stillness, who has been raised in the presence of stillness, who has perhaps inherited stillness from one of his parents. Marguerite held him against her shoulder, and he looked at the candle that André held, and the light of the candle was in his dark eyes, and he tracked it without reaching for it, which I noted because it was the specific kind of attentiveness that I associated with much older children. I performed the ceremony as I had been trained to perform it. I asked the necessary questions of the godmother, which was a role that Constance filled with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything. And I read the necessary prayers, and then I poured the water. I poured it 3 times, once for each person of the Trinity, the way I had been taught. And I said the words, "Luke, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." And then I will tell you what happened. The child turned his head toward my voice when I said his name. He turned it precisely, not in the vague, undirected way of an infant responding to sound, but with the specific orientation of a person who has heard their own name and recognized it as their name and has turned toward the one who spoke it. And he looked at me. He looked at me in the way that a child looks at an adult. When the adult has done something the child considers significant, which is a particular look I had learned to recognize in years of parish work, a look that contains both attention and assessment. He looked at me for, I would say, 4 or 5 seconds, and then he looked back at the candle. That is the detail of the baptism I have not spoken of to any person living since the morning it occurred, except to Brother Andre, who looked at me over the child's head immediately afterward with an expression that told me he had seen it too, and who said nothing, because Andre Morin was a man who understood that there are some things you do not say aloud in the moment, because the moment is too large for the words, and you wait until you have lived with it long enough to say it clearly. I am looking out my kitchen window as I record this. The street outside is grey and ordinary, and the coffee on the table has gone cold, and I am 78 years old, and I have thought about that moment on the 14th of August, 1954, for more than 60 years. I have thought about it in the particular way that you think about things that are impossible, but that you know, with the certainty of a witness, actually occurred. I have thought about what it means for a child to recognize his name at 9 months of age, spoken for the first time in a ceremony he cannot have understood, and to turn toward the voice that spoke it with the directness of recognition. I have not arrived at a conclusion. I have not tried to. The arriving at conclusions is not what this recording is for. This recording is for the facts. There is one more thing I must tell you about that morning, and it is the thing that I said earlier I would come to, when I poured the water for the 3rd time and said Luke's name. I looked up from the font toward the open door of the chapel. The door faced east, toward the tree line, and the morning light was coming in at a low angle through the spruce, the kind of August light that is already golden by 7 in the morning in that country. And in the opening of the door, at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 60 feet away, there was a figure standing. I had seen the figure before in the previous 9 months, twice. Once at a distance of perhaps 100 yards, at the south end of the clearing, in the early autumn of 1953, and once closer, perhaps 40 feet, at the edge of the woodshed in the winter of that same year. In the blue dark of 5 in the morning, when I had risen for matins and gone to the woodshed for kindling, both times I had seen it clearly enough to know its scale, which was between 8 and 9 feet in height, broad at the shoulder, the colour of dark spruce bark in the shadow, and of dark maple in the light, standing with a stillness that I have always associated with large wild animals who have decided, for reasons of their own, that the best response to a human's presence is absolute stillness. Both times I had stood for a moment, and then continued with what I was doing, because there was nothing else to do, and because in both cases the figure had not moved toward me, or in any way altered its posture. On the morning of the 14th of August, 1954, at the door of the chapel, it was different. It was different because the figure was not standing at the edge of the clearing, but at the edge of the door frame, which meant it had come across the open ground of the clearing to a position where it could see the interior of the chapel, and because it was not at rest in the way it had been at rest on the 2 previous occasions. I use the word rest deliberately. What I mean is that on the 2 previous occasions, the stillness had been the stillness of a being that was watching and choosing to remain unnoticed, which is one kind of stillness. This was the stillness of a being that was not trying to be unnoticed. It was standing at the door of my chapel in full morning light, and it was watching its child receive the sacrament of baptism. I looked at it. It looked at the child. Marguerite did not turn her head. She knew. I understood, in that moment, that she had left the door open deliberately, and that this was not something she had asked me to do, but something she had done herself, quietly, before the ceremony began, and that this was her decision, and she did not require my permission to make it, and she did not require my acknowledgement of it, and this too was something I filed carefully and held. The figure at the door did not move during the ceremony. It was there when I poured the water and spoke the words, and it was there when I anointed the child with chrism, and it was there for the concluding prayers. When the ceremony ended and I turned back toward the font to replace the vessel, and then turned again toward the door, it was gone. Not retreating, gone. The tree line was still. The golden morning light was still. There was nothing in the doorway but light. I said nothing to anyone about what I had seen. Constance said nothing. André said nothing. Marguerite said nothing. We stood in the chapel for a few minutes in the quiet that follows a ceremony. And then Constance said she would make breakfast, and we went to the cookhouse and ate. And the child sat on his mother's lap and held a wooden spoon that Constance had given him and examined it with great care and attention, and it was an entirely ordinary morning. I wrote the entry in the baptismal ledger that evening, by lamplight, at my desk in the rectory. I wrote it precisely, the date, the name, the sponsors, the officiating priest, and in the column marked notes I wrote one word, because the ledger required something in that column, and the word I wrote was witnessed. I have thought about that word for 66 years. I chose it because it was accurate. It was the most accurate word I had. The ledger went to the diocese in 1958, when Bishop Hebert ordered a consolidation of all mission records in anticipation of a reorganization of the northern parishes. I sent it in March. It was returned to me in September for my continuing reference, and when I opened it to the 1954 section, I saw immediately that the August entry was gone. Not damaged, not obscured, gone. The page was otherwise intact. The entry before it and the entry after it were in their places. Only Luke's entry had been removed, with a precision that suggested not accident but deliberate excision, the kind that is done carefully by someone who knows what they are doing, with a razor and a ruler. In November of 1958, I received a letter from the bishop's office summoning me to a meeting in Hurst. I went. Bishop Bear was a man of 60 at that time, thin-faced, precise in speech, a canon lawyer by training, and he received me in his office with the particular courtesy of a man who has already decided what is going to happen, and considers courtesy the appropriate container for a decision that is already made. He told me that the diocese had received a report, through channels he did not specify, regarding an irregular baptism performed at St. Brendan's Mission in August of 1954. He told me that he had reviewed the matter and determined that the record of that baptism should not be preserved in the diocesan archive. He told me that he was not accusing me of any canonical violation, precisely, but that he expected me to understand that there were matters involving the northern missions that were best handled with discretion. He did not say what the report contained or who had sent it. He did not ask me to tell him what I knew. He asked me to give my word that I would not seek to restore the record or speak of the matter to persons outside the seal of confession. I gave my word. I was transferred to a different mission 6 months later. I want to be fair to Bishop Hebert. I have had 66 years to be angry with him. And I discovered a long time ago that anger of that duration is not useful and is not true to the person underneath it. What I believe after all those years is this: he did not know what he was burying. He knew that something irregular had occurred, and he was a canon lawyer and a diocesan administrator, and his job was to protect the institution. And the most efficient way to protect an institution from an irregularity is to erase the irregularity from the record. He never met Luke. He never stood at the door of a chapel at 7 in the morning in August and watched a being that had no name in any document look at its child being baptized. He never held the child's small, dark-furred hands, which Constance sometimes allowed me to do on my visits. And he never heard Luke's voice, which, by the age of 3, had a quality that I can only describe as tonal, a series of sounds that were not words in any language I could identify, but that his mother and Philomene responded to with complete fluency, as though the language were obvious, as though it had always been there, as though any other communication would have been the strange choice. Bishop Hebert knew none of this. He knew only what was in a report, and reports do not contain the things that matter. I kept visiting. The diocese did not prohibit my visiting Marguerite Savard's family, because, as far as the diocese knew, there was nothing unusual about a priest visiting a widow with 2 children in his former parish. I visited twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, taking the bus to Hurst and then getting a ride north with whoever was heading that direction, which was usually Henri Gauthier or one of his people, and spending 3 days at the mission before returning. I watched Luke grow. I watched him in the way that a man watches something he cannot fully account for, and has decided he does not need to account for, which is a specific kind of watching that requires you to be entirely present and entirely without agenda, and it is harder than it sounds. By the time he was 4 years old, he stood 4 feet and 2 inches, which I measured against the doorframe of the cookhouse on my spring visit in 1957, because Constance and I had taken to measuring him and recording it in a small notebook that Constance kept in the kitchen drawer. His hands were large and dark-haired along the knuckles, and his eyes were the deep brown of boreal water in October. And when he looked at you, he looked with an attentiveness that I had come to think of as the family characteristic, because it was the same quality I had seen in the figure at the door of the chapel, that quality of total, unperformed presence. He did not speak French or Cree in any recognizable way, but he communicated with his mother and sister through the tonal sounds I had first noticed at 3, and through gesture, and through a kind of proximity that communicated information I could not decode, but that the people who lived with him clearly could. He was affectionate with Philomene. He was careful with Constance, who by 1957 was 68 years old and moved slowly, and he understood her slowness and adjusted to it, without being asked. I watched him once carry an armload of firewood to the door of the cookhouse and set it down without a sound, and then stand for a moment looking at Constance at the stove, and then go back for a second armload, because he had observed that the first armload would not be enough for the evening. He was 4 years old. By the time he was 8, he was 5 feet and 9 inches, which I recorded in Constance's notebook in October of 1961. And by the time he was 12, he was taller than Henri Gauthier, who was himself a large man. And by 14, he was taller than anyone in the community, and broader at the shoulder, and the dark hair that covered his arms, and the backs of his hands had extended to cover more of him. Though he wore long sleeves and trousers in the warm months and a heavy coat in the cold months, and moved through the settlement without drawing any attention that he and his mother had not carefully managed. He lived simply, he worked, he cut wood, and he helped with the trap lines, and he carried things that were too heavy for other people to carry. And he did these things with the same composure his mother had, the composure of a person who has decided that the life they have been given is the life they intend to live fully. I need to say something about what I did not see, because I think the record would be distorted without it. I did not see the father during those visits. In the 16 years between the baptism and the summer I am about to describe, I did not see the figure from the chapel door again, not directly, not in a way that I could record as a sighting. What I did see, on perhaps 6 or 7 occasions across those years, were signs of presence at the edge of the settlement that I had learned to read. The dog that Constance kept in those years, an old blue heeler named Marcel, would stop at the Treeline in the evenings sometimes and stand looking into the dark spruce with his tail still, not a threatened stillness, but an attentive one. The way an old dog stands when it recognizes a familiar presence rather than an unfamiliar one. I noted this. I held it. I said nothing about it to anyone, because by that point I had learned that the people of that settlement communicated about this particular matter with an economy that made words seem excessive, and that the most respectful thing I could do was match their economy. Constance died in the winter of 1965. She died in her own house, which was the house she had shared with her husband before the drowning, and which she had kept immaculately for 20 years afterward. And she died at 76 years of age, with Marguerite at her side, and Philomene at her side, and Luke sitting outside the door in the cold, because the house was small, and he had grown too large to be comfortably inside it without displacing the living. But he sat outside the door in weather that was 30 below, and he did not go inside, and he did not go away. And when Marguerite came out to tell him that Constance had died, he made a sound that I was not there to hear, but that Marguerite described to me on my next visit as the sound he had been making since the beginning when something had ended, a low tonal sound that descended and stopped, and that she had heard it once before. She said, "When a moose died on the bank of the river below their cabin in the spring of his 3rd year, and he had gone to the bank alone and stood for half an hour and made the same sound, and that she had understood then that he recognized ending, and that he marked it, and that this was enough." Brother André Moron left the mission in 1966 and returned to his family in Sturgeon Falls, and eventually became a schoolteacher, which suited him. He and I wrote letters for 50 years, and every letter contained a paragraph that did not reference Luke by name, but that I understood, and that I believe he intended me to understand, as a continued account of his thinking on the matter. He never wavered. He died in 2019 at 87, and his last letter to me arrived 3 weeks before his death and contained a single sentence that I have read many times since, which was, "I have thought about that morning for 65 years, Father, and I am still satisfied with what we did." I keep that letter in the drawer of my desk, and I read it sometimes in the evenings, and I think he was right to be satisfied. Marguerite and Luke left the settlement in the summer of 1971. Luke was 17 years old by the calendar, and he was the height and breadth of his father. as best as I could measure, against the memory of the chapel door, which is to say 8 feet, and perhaps more, and he could no longer move through the settlement without drawing a kind of attention that all of them had agreed, without saying so, could not continue indefinitely. The Gauthier brothers had been replaced by a generation of younger men who drove trucks on the bush roads and who asked questions that the older generation had known better than to ask, and the provincial government had put a forestry office in Hurst that sent people up the valley sometimes. And the world ain't changing in the ways that worlds change. In the 1960s and 1970s, which is to say it was getting smaller and louder and more administrative. I was there for the leaving. I was on my spring visit in June of 1971, and I knew, when I arrived, that something had changed in the settlement's atmosphere, a quality of completion that is different from simply the end of something, though it contains that too. Marguerite told me on the second evening that they would be leaving at the end of the week. She told me plainly, without preamble, sitting at the kitchen table of the cookhouse, which by then was being run by a younger woman. And she told me that Philomene would stay, because Philomene had her own life and her own house and her own reasons for staying, and that she and Luke would go north, into the country above Nagagami Lake, and that they did not intend to come back. I asked if she knew what she was going toward. She said yes. I asked if she had been in communication, and she looked at me in a way that was not quite a smile, and said that she had been in communication in one form or another since 1953, and that the form it took was not one she could describe to me accurately, and that she trusted I would accept that. I said I accepted it. She nodded. On the last morning, I walked with them to the north end of the clearing. Philomene was there. Marcel was long dead by then. There was a younger dog, a red tick hound named Gaston, and Gaston walked beside Luke with his tail carried low and calm, the way a dog walks beside someone he has walked beside every day of his life. The morning was early, the light still white and cool through the spruce, and Luke walked ahead of his mother at first, and then beside her, and when they reached the edge of the tree line, he stopped and turned and looked back at me. I have thought about that look for 53 years. I want to say something about what it contained, and I want to be careful because I am a man who distrusts the attribution of interior states to beings whose interior I cannot access, and Luke was, by any measure available to me, a being whose interior I could not access, and yet I have spent more than half a century thinking about what that look contained, and I believe I can tell you. It was the same look he had given me in the chapel when he was 9 months old and heard his name for the first time. It was the look of a person acknowledging a specific thing that a specific other person has done, and finding it sufficient and indicating sufficiency in the only way available to them, which was the look itself. He looked at me for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he turned and walked into the spruce with his mother, and they went north, and they did not look back. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time after they were gone. Philomene stood beside me and did not speak, which was correct. The tree line was still. Gaston sat down at the point where the path entered the timber and watched the direction they had gone. And then, after a while, he turned and walked back toward the cookhouse, and I walked back too, because there was nothing else to do. I am recording this in my kitchen on Theriot Street in Timmins on the 7th of May. The street outside is ordinary, and the coffee on the table has been cold for an hour, and I am 78 years old, and I am the last living person who was in that chapel on the 14th of August, 1954. Philomene is gone. Constance is gone. André is gone. Henri Gauthier died in 1987. His brother died in 1998. Marguerite Savard, to the best of my knowledge, is not dead because I have seen no evidence of her death, and I believe I would know, in the way that a priest who has known someone for 20 years believes he would know such a thing, and I do not know it. That is all I will say about that. The baptismal ledger for St. Brendan's Mission is in the Diocesan Archive in Hurst. The 1954 section has a gap. The entry that I wrote by lamplight on the evening of the 14th of August, 1954, in my own hand, with my own pen, in the standard format required by the diocese, is not there, but I am here. I am here, and the recorder is running, and I am telling you that on the 14th of August, 1954, at St. Brendan's Mission on the Nagagami River in northern Ontario, I poured the waters of baptism on a child named Luke, born in November of the previous year, to a woman named Marguerite Savard. And I spoke the words of the sacrament, and the child turned to the sound of his name. And there was a witness at the door who did not belong to any institutional record, but who was present, nonetheless, and who saw what was done, and who, I believe, understood what was done, in whatever way such understanding is possible. The Church teaches that the sacraments are acts of God, mediated through the Church, and that the validity of a sacrament does not depend on the worthiness of the minister, but on the correct form and the correct intention. I had the correct form. I had the correct intention. What the Church would make of the rest of the circumstances, I am not able to say, and I was never able to say it, and in 66 years it has not stopped being true that I am not able to say it. What I can say is this: the child looked at me when I spoke his name. The child was present in that chapel on that morning, as present as anyone I have ever stood before in the performance of the sacrament. And whatever was standing in the door of the chapel was also present, and it did not turn away. I do not know what Luke is. I do not know what his father is. I do not know what the 41 days in the spring of 1953 contained, or what Marguerite told her son about his origins, or what the tonal sounds they exchanged in the kitchen of her cabin over 17 years communicated. I do not know where they are now, in the country above Nagagami Lake, or whether the word now means the same thing to them that it means to me sitting at this kitchen table. I do not know these things. No one knows them. What I know is what I witnessed, and what I witnessed is what I have told you. And I have told it as accurately as I know how, and I believe it is enough. I believe that a record which is removed from an archive does not cease to be true, and that the truth of a thing does not require institutional confirmation in order to exist, and that the child I held for 30 seconds in a cookhouse in northern Ontario in November of 1953 was real and whole and present and deserving of the name that was spoken over him in the only ceremony I had available to give. The recorder is still running. I am going to leave it running while I get up and heat the coffee. Outside Ontario Street, the morning is grey and ordinary, and I am, as I said, 78 years old, and I am the last one who knows, and now you know, and that will have to be sufficient. I think it is sufficient. I think the world is more full than the records show.